Casey with the In God production team, and I'm here with Pastor Cage this Sunday, doing our second episode of Sermon Notes, where we just talk amongst family and friends about faith and try to have a conversation about what the most recent sermon and just kind of dive a little bit deeper. So last week, Pastor Cage, you talked about the innocent blood of a brother. And if you could just give a little brief summary of last week's sermon.
Yeah, last week the sermon topic was motivated by the death of George Floyd of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and our thoughts and our preparation was toward that and trying to bring awareness and attention to another young black man has been murdered in the streets of America.
Mm-hmm. And I recall that you came out of 2 Kings last week, and there were some biblical examples that you talked about, Josiah and even Jesus Christ. What I really wanted to ask you were, what are some modern examples of godly leadership, if you see any, that we might be able to kind of make a connection just to our modern times? And if you don't have a specific person in mind, what are some of the qualities people should look for when they're looking for spiritual leadership?
Well, who comes to mind foremost for me are men like the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the late Malcolm X. I believe they embody what real spiritual leadership is. I think we've been in a 50-year void of spiritual leadership, but Josiah, out of all the kings, he walked in not only the lineage but the legacy of King David. He was out of that lineage, and it was under his administration that reform happened for the nation of Israel.
So what I'm hearing, you touched on reform. So is that one quality that people could look for in spiritual leadership, a person who's kind of a reformer?
I believe so. I think that when you have someone who has a connection with God, who has compassion for people, I think it's those kind of men and women that can bring genuine change to a culture.
Mm. And so for our biblical example, just to dive a little bit deeper on Josiah, because you said that in a modern context, we would look at more like a Martin Luther King, a Malcolm X, in that same frame of reference. What were some of the specific things that Josiah did to build that reform?
Well, one of the things he did was to call the men of God. He called the prophets and the priests, and the first thing he did, he went into the temple and got the book. He got the Torah, the Old Testament scripture, and asked the priest to read the scriptures to him. And notice when Jesus is in the temple, when you look at him going in and stood up before the people, he took the scroll out, he took the Old Testament scripture. And so oftentimes, because we don't have spiritual leadership involved, that's one of the void missing when we have leadership like we do today, especially in the political realm. So he brought reform by bringing spiritual men to the table. And I believe that no one man can do it by himself. You have to have a team of people who are committed to the things of God in terms of our morality and our spirituality.
So I'm hearing two things, having a team, and then also having a moral code, like a spiritual moral code that people can really grasp and understand.
I would say a moral compass.
Okay, Moral compass.
And the reason I say that, we need something to guide us and to direct us. And one of the things that they had uh, the covenant that Moses made with God on Mount Sinai, which became a moral compass and a covenant, meaning that something to guide us, but something that also that we would agree to.
Mm. Right, right. And I think that that guidance is really important. I wanted to also ask about your second point. So, the second thing that you had kind of espoused upon was that we have to kind of value human life and that life should be considered sacred. We have this conversation a lot of times when someone is killed as violently as George Floyd in the street, and you hear it often, and a lot of people, shut it down. The topic of community violence, and I think one of the things that you raised was that even though we don't want to equate um, police brutality and racial violence with community violence, violence that happens in people's own communities. Because they are definitely two different things. Just historically, they're totally different. But ultimately, it comes down to a value of life. And a lot of times, we struggle with that. And I wanted to know, what do you think some possible solutions could be for both, on both ends, both on the face of community violence and also, some actions we might be able to take as far as racial and police violence?
Well, one of the easiest way, when you look at the Mosaic Law, uh, um, uh, the Decalogue, the Deuteronomy Code of living, Moses instruct us, "Thou shalt not kill." I think that "thou shalt not kill" means that not only the sacredness of life, but also the sanctity of life. I just think it's wrong to kill, whether it's black on black, whether it's police brutality, uh, all manners of killing, whether you drop a bomb on the country of Japan, on the cities of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, whether you're in Germany and you put 6 million Jews in gas chambers. I think it's totally wrong to kill. Now, what has to happen? Well, people has to change. For the culture to change, we have to change. And I think one of the problems that we have is that we believe that change will happen by itself. But I don't believe that it will happen by itself.
Right, and you're absolutely right. It definitely won't happen by itself. As you know, I'm a teacher, and I actually had a conversation with my students today just about some practical steps. And we even actually talked last Sunday with our church family about some things that each of us can do. Um, Tying back in that note of spiritual leadership and the kind of qualities that we should be looking for, that moral compass, um, in that solid team. What are some ways that people can hold our leadership accountable when we notice that even on the face of a lot of our faith-based communities, a lot of just our local communities in general, there's a lapse of an accountability structure for us to kind of understand who's in charge of what and hold people accountable. And I just want to know your thoughts on, number one, how we can hold our leaders accountable, how we can kind of seek out that moral compass in leadership and kind of hold people to that moral compass.
I believe, Casey, we have to get back to the center and to the origin and the ideology in which this country was founded upon. And if we can get back to that, I believe when you talk about of the things that we're seeing, even in the death of George Floyd, we see that people are involved. They are involved across racial lines, across economic lines, and because they're out protesting, that things has happened. Originally, only one officer was arrested. All four now have been. And so I believe through your voice and your vote, that brings about the change. And hold those who we vote for, we hold them accountable.
Right. You're absolutely right. I agree 100% because something that's interesting um, that we kind of touched on last week when we talked about moving from protest to progress. Many people don't realize that the type of change that the protesters in Minneapolis were able to achieve, it's so possible because a lot of those officials were moving on the local level. When you talk about the mayor of Minneapolis immediately speaking out and telling the police chief, you have to, do something. And, in many cases, police chiefs are appointed by mayors. So if the mayor is telling the police chief publicly do something, you're going to see that action. And I think that that's one of those things where you just had this huge upshoot in engagement. So I think that's absolutely right.
Well, that is the level of accountability because everybody responded to the voices of those who was crying the loudest.
Yeah.
And even when President Trump stood out in front of the St. John Church, because of the voices of the masses, immediately those who were silent came out and spoke up against the mishandled authority and the misguided leadership of Donald Trump. So I think we're where we ought to be, but I believe that the beginning is like Josiah did. He brought spiritual leaders around him, and therefore his reign was for 31 years, and Israel had been reformed. And the blessing is with the leadership of Josiah that he died on the battlefield. George Floyd died on the battlefield.
Yes, yeah. And even like that note of, dying on the battlefield, like that's really important to mention because you have a lot of our leadership. I think as young people we get discouraged because you hear people say Martin did it peacefully, Malcolm said by any means necessary, and they both ended up getting killed. But I think the more important thing to note is that they both kind of died on the battlefield, and that kind of shows you it's not necessarily that these people are being killed because everybody's gonna die, right? But it's they died. That shows you that the work continues after they passed away. People picked up the mantle, and it just has to be a continual thing. It can't just stop with one person.
Well, Dr. King stated that if a man or woman haven't found anything worth dying for, they're unfit to live. And so the ultimate goal is Jesus on Calvary and his death. No death, no resurrection. No resurrection, no redemption. And so the reason that we can sing aloud that I've been redeemed is because of the redemptive process that happened on Calvary.
Well, I think that's an amazing point. I know we got to wrap this up, but let's just hope for and pray for redemption for America because we did have those spiritual tones, those a perfect union, a more perfect union, those ideals in the beginning, and really at this point, it's really just about us working towards that.
Amen. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, amen. God bless you.